So this will be the last lecture on Gandhi's autobiography, and this lecture is on chapter 8, which is titled Stealing and Atonement. So we'll straight away get get into the excerpts that I have selected from this text, and we're going to talk about these excerpts. So, as the title of this chapter, gives away sort of, this is about an incident about stealing and the subsequent atonement that came after it. And this is one of Gandhi's many experiments with truth, as his book is very aptly titled. So, let's go ahead and look at these excerpts, and then we'll see how this chapter adds up to this entire narrative of Gandhi's experimentations with truth. So here goes. A relative and I became fond of smoking. Not that we saw any good in smoking or were enamored of the smell of a cigarette. We simply imagined a sort of pleasure in emitting clouds of smoke from our mouths. But we had no money. So as the incident definitely gives away without concealing anything. So at at a certain point in his life, it seems Gandhi and one of his friends, it seems, were attracted to smoking because just out of the sheer pleasure of emitting clouds of smoke from their mouths. But there was one hurdle: they had no money, right? And it is this lack of money, and we'll come across yet another problem, which sort of uh, prepare the base for the act of stealing. So one, of course, is a lack of money. We'll get into the other one. So we began to steal coppers from the servants' pocket in order to purchase Indian cigarettes. We could not, of course, smoke in the presence of elders. So you see, effectively, it was the lack of money. But of course, they were children. You don't expect children to have a lot of money, of course. And it was this scenario which led Gandhi and his relative here to steal money. Copper is a reference to money. It's a surrogate for money here. It's a reference to copper coins. So he and his friends started stealing coppers from the servant's pocket, mind you, servant's pocket money to be more specific, in order to purchase cigarettes, right? And before that, there are a few instances where he talks about, you know, smoking the leftovers of the butt end of the cigarettes that his uncle or someone else used to smoke. But then that was never very satisfactory, and hence they started stealing so they could buy cigarettes. So you see, the act of stealing uh, roots from a very trivial thing, if I may. But as in the example of meat eating, which we have seen in the previous two chapters, we are going to see how an apparently uh, trivial desire of smoking, which led to stealing, also leads to atonement, which is in the title of the chapter. So, stealing and atonement, one following the other. Let's look at the third excerpt. We were far from being satisfied with such things as these meaning as smoking. Our want of independence began to smart. It was unbearable that we should be able to do anything without the elders' permission. At last, in sheer disgust, we decided to commit suicide. Now, uh, it prima facie it appears very funny uh, to think that someone would want to commit suicide just because not because they were not able to smoke. But of course, if you look deeper, if you you know look more closely, you begin to see there are more reasons to it. Now, this smoking, as they have mentioned before, as Gandhi has mentioned before, was not something he and his friend did out of pleasure, or not out of pleasure, meaning not not because the cigarette smelled particularly good, or that they saw any good in it, but rather just because they started, they developed a liking for emitting clouds of smoke, right? But then, as it happens with addictive substances, they got addicted to it. And at the point when they got addicted to it, there was no way. that they could not have it, and as a result they had to start stealing. So you see, one thing leads to another, right? And um and it was the stealing which became the most problematic thing. On the other hand, there was also the problem of not having enough freedom at home, right? Because as Gandhi has mentioned in previous chapters too, there was a degree of control being exercised by the family, right, on the independence of the children, right? And remember, in contrast, that Gandhi himself had been an authoritative husband at that time. Of course, he was a child, and of course, he critiques that later on. But just to give you the contrast, um, while he was, trying to actively trying to stop his wife from having, uh, any freedom of movement, as mentioned in one of the previous chapters, the same person here, uh, you know he suffers from the inability to do anything without the elder's permission. So you see, what he did to his wife back then was also being done to him as well. This is not to be judgmental on Gandhi, but to make an observation about the duality of his nature back then, which he himself importantly um criticizes retrospectively, right? So he says it became unbearable to not be able to do anything without permission from the elders. And at last, in sheer disgust, we decided to commit suicide. So, prima facie, it may look funny that just because they were not able to smoke, they decided to commit suicide. So, it is not that simple, right? Uh, Add to that the fact that they had such a restrictive life where they had to get permission for almost everything from their parents, and that became a problem. Okay, so let's see what happens after they decided to commit suicide. He says, "But our courage failed us. Supposing we were not instantly killed, and what was the good of killing ourselves? Why not rather put up with the lack of independence?" So you see, conflicting thoughts once again, and despite having decided to commit suicide, uh, Gandhi was met with contrasting thoughts, with opposing thoughts, uh, which went on from what would be the good of killing ourselves to why not rather put up with the lack of independence. So why not confront the elders and earn independence, right? So he says, I realized that it was not as easy to commit suicide as to contemplate it. And since then, whenever I have heard of someone threatening to commit suicide, it has had or no effect on me, right? This on effect is apparently a typo. It definitely is. It has had little or no effect on me, right? But the stealing episode did not. Um, you know, it has a little more to it, right? Let's see what he mentions next. I pilfered, which basically means stole, the coppers when I was 12 or 13, possibly less. The other theft was committed when I was 15. In this case, I stole a bit of gold out of my meat eating brother's armlet. So he talks to two acts of stealing. One, uh, where he stole money from the servants' pocket money and bought cigarettes. And the second was when he stole a bit of gold out of his brother's armlet. So, but at this point, remember, he has earlier mentioned that the one thing he guarded very jealously was his character. And whenever he realized that he had gone a little bit astray, and even a little bit astray, he started to weep. He has mentioned this before. So we know that it is very much like Gandhi to quickly realize after committing a mistake or committing, what he would himself categorize probably as a sin. He would realize it quickly and refrain from doing it further. This was also the case with meat eating, because we saw that he did not like it. He did not have a particular palate for it, of course, but he did not like the thought of meat eating either. And he was also confronted with the thought that if his parents came to know about it, they would really feel bad. They would be shocked. So Gandhi repeatedly, in multiple examples, in multiple incidents, we find him, atoning for whatever mistake he has committed. And here too, it's not smoking which is depicted as the mistake. Rather, it is stealing which is the locus of this chapter, as is implied in the title. So once again, Gandhi himself could not bear uh, the thought that he had committed the act of theft, right? And let's see what happens after this. But this became more than I could bear, and this refers to the second act of stealing. The first act, he had, accepted it, he had made peace with it. But after the act of stealing for a second time, stealing gold from his brother's armlet, it became too difficult for him to bear, and he resolved never to steal again. But that resolution in itself was of little value, because he also made up his mind to confess to his father, right? But why? Why did he confess to his father? We'll get an answer here. He says, I did not dare to speak. In other words, he did not dare to confront his father and tell him that I have committed, I have stolen money, I have stolen gold. Not that. Not that I was afraid of my father beating me. No, I do not recall his ever having beaten any of us. I was afraid of the pain that I should cause him. But I felt that the risk should be taken, that there could not be a cleansing without a clean confession. So, this is the reason. So, one might think that, well, he has stolen and he has realized his mistake and he has decided to not steal again. So that is enough, right? But well, right for a lot of people, maybe not for Gandhi, because Gandhi believes, as he mentions in the last line of the first excerpt, that uh, there could not be a cleansing without a clean confession. He says that if I keep it to myself, I've stolen, I have committed a sin, and I may have stopped stealing, but that does not that does not clean me, that does not exonerate me, right? That does not acquit me. Of course I have stolen. So for for him to be cleansed, he must confess. So for him, confession is a part of atonement, right? So only by confessing can he be clean and his atonement can be complete. So he says that therefore I decided that I must confess to my father that I have stolen. The act of stealing cannot be atoned for only by stopping stealing. So not just he must not just stop stealing, but must also confess to his father that he has stolen. But then the problem was that he did not dare to speak to his father about it, not because he was afraid that his father would beat him, right? Because he said that his father never had beaten any of his children, but because Gandhi was afraid that he would hurt his father by confessing about his act of theft. So, what did he do? He says, I decided at last to write out the confession, to submit it to my father, and ask his forgiveness. So, he did. He wrote a letter to his father, he handed over that piece of paper, and he waited. Uh, so, he read it through, that is, his father read it through, and pearl drops trickled down his cheeks, wetting the paper. For a moment, he closed his eyes and thought, and then tore up the note. He had sat up to read it. He again lay down. I also cried. If you read the chapter, you will know that Gandhi was seated beside his father here. I could see my father's agony. If I were a painter, I could draw a picture of the whole scene today. It is still so vivid in my mind. So you see, his father's reaction is very important here, because as Gandhi has anticipated, his father did not beat him, but as he had also rightly guessed, it did hurt his father. Remember him talk about his father in various contexts. In the first chapter, he introduced his father as a loyal, uh, righteous man. He later also criticized his father, obviously in retrospect, for having married him off as a child. So we have seen Gandhi criticize his father, but also praise the good qualities of his father. Uh, but being a righteous man, as his father was. Gandhi knew that his father would uh, be deeply affected upon knowing that his son had committed the sin of stealing. And as he had rightly guessed, his father does go through, uh, you know, go through agony, right? That's the least we can say. And obviously, his father clearly didn't hurt him as he anticipated he wouldn't, but his father did go through an episode of agony. And Gandhi says that this scene of seeing his father cry, seeing his father weep after reading what he had done, he could paint that picture even today, right? It is how vividly he remembers this incident, this scene. So to end our this lecture, and also to end the entire discussion on Gandhi's autobiography, let's just conclude with the last excerpt where Gandhi says, "This was for me an object lesson in Ahimsa. Then I could read uh, in it nothing more than a father's love. But today I know that it was pure Ahimsa." Right? So the act of his father uh, suffering because of having read the letter and come to know about the terrible act his son had done, but not having violently responded to it. Gandhi says that was an act of ahimsa. And back then, as a child, he had thought that this was an instance of his father's love for him. But he has found, as a grown up man, he has found more nuance to how his father reacted. And he says what his father did back then was an act of pure ahimsa. And this is where chapter 8 ends. And uh, this is also this is also where your portion of the syllabus, uh, that is, the selected portion from this text ends. And I would say this is a very good note to end, uh, this portion of syllabus with, because, as you know, Gandhi, as a politician, he practiced ahimsa, and it was his non-violence movement that that the British found very difficult to deal with, right? And not only did the British find it difficult to deal with, Gandhi's ways of ahimsa, non-violence, uh, they became, to use today's lingo, they went viral, right? What do I mean by that? I mean that many other protesters across the world, we have Nelson Mandela, we have Martin Luther King Jr., who were heavily influenced by Gandhi's way of protesting, and um, that was very influential. So ahimsa, to end with ahimsa, um, is a very good note to end our lecture with. So this ends our discussion of Gandhi's, not just chapter 8, but the entire portion of syllabus from Gandhi's uh, The Story of My Experiments with Truth.